On the afternoon of July 4th, in a stadium in Philadelphia, a World Cup round of 16 match stopped looking like football somewhere around the 20th minute. Elbows found ribs, boots found ankles that had nothing to do with the ball. Players went down clutching shins while the game kept moving around them. And through all of it, one man stood in the center circle with a yellow card in his pocket that never came out. Not once, for the team doing almost all the damage. France beat Paraguay 1-0 that day and moved into the quarterfinals. But almost nobody left that stadium talking about the scoreline. They were talking about the referee. Within 48 hours, a respected French sports paper had handed him one of the lowest ratings it has ever given an official. Former players turned broadcasters were calling the opposing team's conduct a disgrace on live television. A former top-level referee was telling reporters the man in the middle had effectively already been sent home from the tournament. And across football media, one name was suddenly attached to a bigger conversation than anyone expected a round of 16 fixture to produce. This is the story of how one official's 90 minutes became a bigger talking point than a World Cup knockout match itself, and what it reveals about the pressure sitting on the shoulders of the people we trust to keep this sport fair, especially at the one tournament where the whole world is watching at once. So the question worth asking isn't really, was this a bad match? Bad matches happen every tournament, in every competition, at every level of the sport. Tempers flare, tackles fly in late, and sometimes a game just runs hot. The real question is this: how does a FIFA-listed official with 13 years of experience walk out of a World Cup knockout game having booked one team 3 times and the other team 0 times, despite that second team committing well over a dozen fouls? And what does it say about how officials are selected, trained, supported, and held accountable on the biggest stage the sport has to offer? Because if the answer is simply these things happen, that's a far more uncomfortable conclusion than most fans are prepared to accept about the tournament they've waited 4 years for. To understand why this match detonated the way it did, you have to understand what Paraguay were trying to do and why so much sympathy existed for them before a ball was even kicked. They arrived in the round of 16 as the story of the tournament so far, aside nobody outside their own camp expected to get this deep, having already eliminated Germany on penalties in a result that shocked most of the football world. Their plan against France was never a secret, and nobody watching needed inside information to see it forming. Sit deep, stay compact, frustrate one of the most talented attacking lineups in the competition, absorb pressure for as long as possible, and try to drag the game somewhere unpredictable, the way they had against the Germans. For long stretches, that plan worked beautifully on its own terms. France didn't register their first shot on target until well into the second half of the match. Paraguay's goalkeeper, Orlando Gil, who had already become something of a folk hero back home after the Germany result, was making save after save, reading angles well and standing tall under real pressure. On pure tactical terms, this was a defensive performance worth genuine admiration, the kind of underdog setup that neutral fans usually end up rooting for by instinct. That's what makes what happened alongside it so frustrating for anyone who actually respects the way Paraguay had set up to compete. Event number 1. Because somewhere alongside that disciplined defensive shape, the physical approach tipped into something else entirely, and it didn't take long to show itself. Reports from multiple outlets covering the match describe a pattern that repeated itself again and again through the first half and into the second. A France player would be fouled, sometimes well away from the ball, sometimes with a shove or a stray arm that had nothing to do with winning possession, and the whistle simply wouldn't come. One passage frequently cited by observers involved Paraguay's Matias Galarza, who was involved in 2 separate incidents during the match. One where he threw an arm toward Kylian Mbappe as the French forward ran into space, and later in the same half, another incident involving Jules Koundé. Neither incident was whistled as a foul at all, let alone carded, according to multiple outlets who reviewed the footage afterward. According to reporting from Yahoo Sports and other publications that broke down the match, this wasn't an isolated lapse in concentration from the referee. It was a theme that built across the 90 minutes, visible enough that pundits watching live were commenting on it well before full time. Why it matters. This matters for a reason that goes beyond one match's card count. A referee's most basic job, more fundamental than any single individual decision, is to set a line early in the game and hold that same line consistently for both sides for the full 90 minutes. When players sense that certain conduct will go unpunished, they don't calm down in response. They escalate, because the incentives in front of them say escalation carries no cost. That isn't a cynical read on human nature. It's simply how competitive sport behaves under pressure, at every level from a Sunday league pitch to a World Cup knockout tie. Once one team senses no consequences are coming, the contest stops being decided purely by skill, tactics, and fitness, and starts being decided by which side is willing to go further than the other. That shift is exactly what several broadcasters and former players said they watched unfold in real time. Event number 2. The clearest illustration of that imbalance is the card count itself, and it's worth sitting with the actual numbers rather than a general impression. By full time, Paraguay had committed somewhere in the range of 12 to 13 fouls across the match, several of them the kind that draw audible reactions from both sets of fans and visible frustration from broadcasters calling the game. Their total number of yellow cards for the entire 90 minutes, plus stoppage time, 0. France, meanwhile, picked up 3 yellow cards across the same match. Didier Deschamps, France's manager, addressed this directly in his post-match press conference. He declined to criticize the referee by name, and he also declined to criticize Paraguay directly, choosing his words carefully in the way most experienced managers do immediately after a tense win. But he did point out, without being asked twice, that his side had picked up 3 cautions despite facing what he described as a heavy volume of fouls committed against them. When a winning manager feels compelled to note that disparity unprompted in a press conference where the easy and safe move is simply to celebrate the result and move on, it tells you the imbalance was obvious enough that staying silent on it wasn't really an option, even for someone with every incentive to avoid controversy. Wider implications. The wider implication here reaches well beyond one match and one referee's afternoon. World football's governing body has spent the better part of a decade building infrastructure specifically designed to reduce this kind of inconsistency across international competition, video review technology, dedicated match observers assigned to grade officials, and post-tournament performance reviews that in theory shape who gets selected for the next major event. And yet, a scenario like this one is a blunt reminder that no amount of technology fixes a referee's in-game decision-making in real time, particularly around the threshold for a yellow card, which remains almost entirely a human judgment call rather than something a camera can definitively rule on. Video review can correct a wrongly awarded goal or step in on a clearly missed penalty. It cannot retroactively hand out a caution for a shove that happened 40 minutes earlier and was waved away without a second look by the person standing closest to it. That gap between what technology can fix and what it can't is exactly where this match lived for most of its 90 minutes. Event number 3. That gap became the deciding moment of the entire match. In the second half, France's substitute Désiré Doué drove into the penalty area, beat a defender, and was brought down by Paraguay's Diego Gomez in a challenge that had little to do with the ball. The referee initially waved play on, giving nothing at all, and Paraguay's players reacted with visible relief as the whistle stayed silent. It took an intervention from the video assistant referee to send him to the pitchside monitor, where, after reviewing the replay for himself, he reversed his own initial call and awarded the penalty to France. Kylian Mbappe stepped up and converted it, sending the goalkeeper the wrong way, and that single kick turned out to be the difference between France advancing to the quarterfinals and a Paraguay side that had already shocked one European giant doing it again to another. In other words, the actual outcome of a World Cup knockout match rested not on the referee's own read of the decisive moment, but on a separate piece of officiating technology stepping in to correct a call he had already made and gotten wrong. Institutional analysis. This is where the governing body's own selection and assignment process becomes fair game for real scrutiny rather than just frustration aimed at one individual. The official in question, Ilgiz Tantashev of Uzbekistan, had been a FIFA-listed referee for 13 years before this tournament and had spoken publicly and enthusiastically in promotional material released ahead of the competition about being chosen to officiate at football's biggest stage. Former Premier League officiating chief Keith Hackett, speaking to reporters after the match, said the performance reflected a referee who was simply not equipped to handle a fixture of that intensity and magnitude, and he questioned aloud how Tantashev came to be selected for an assignment this significant in the first place. Hackett indicated that the response from tournament organizers, according to his understanding of the situation, was to remove Tantashev from further involvement in the competition, effectively ending his World Cup on the spot, even though no formal on-the-record punishment had been issued publicly through official channels at that point. It's worth pausing on that distinction because it says something important about how these situations tend to be handled institutionally. Quietly, informally, through background conversations with people like Hackett rather than public statements, and often without the transparency that fans, players, and even the referees themselves are asking for in the moment they actually want answers. This wasn't even the tournament's first officiating flashpoint. Earlier in the competition, a different referee had already faced public criticism over a contested red card shown to an American striker, criticism that reached all the way up to political commentary questioning the decision. Taken together, these moments paint a picture of a tournament where the spotlight on individual officials has been unusually intense, and where the margin for error has shrunk to almost nothing, given how closely every decision is now dissected within minutes of it happening. Counter-argument. Now, it would be incomplete and frankly unfair to lay every ounce of blame at one man's feet without acknowledging the other side of this story. Paraguay's approach was not accidental incompetence stumbling its way through 90 minutes. It was a deliberate physical strategy deployed against a technically superior opponent. And physical, combative football is not against the rules simply because it's uncomfortable for a neutral audience to watch. Plenty of matches at this level involve teams using their bodies to disrupt rhythm and break up attacking momentum, and officials are given genuine discretion in how tightly they choose to police that line, match to match. Some observers have also noted that France, for all the sympathy they received afterward in the media, were not entirely blameless either. 3 yellow cards is not nothing. And Kylian Mbappe himself acknowledged after the match that France knew how to match some of that physicality when the situation called for it, rather than simply absorbing it and turning the other cheek. There's also a broader, more sympathetic argument worth making about the referee himself. Officials at a World Cup are operating under an extraordinary amount of pressure, calling a match in front of a global television audience with every decision replayed from 6 different camera angles within seconds of it happening, and second-guessed by millions of people who never have to make that call live in real time, with players screaming in both ears. None of that erases the disparity in cards between the two sides. But it does complicate the idea that this was simple villainy or incompetence from one man standing alone in the middle of a hostile stadium. Bigger picture. Step back far enough, though, and this stops being a story about one referee's afternoon and becomes a story about the margins the sport is willing to tolerate at its very highest level. Compare this fixture directly to the Canada versus Morocco match that took place the same day, where referee Michael Oliver issued 8 yellow cards before halftime alone. That approach drew some criticism in the moment for being overly strict, with a few observers suggesting he was being heavy-handed early. But by most accounts, it also produced a calmer, more controlled second half, because both sides understood clearly and early exactly where the line sat and what would happen if they crossed it. Tantashev's match produced the opposite outcome entirely. Full-time confrontations between players from both benches, a general sense among broadcasters and pundits that control had been lost somewhere in the first half hour and never recovered, and a lingering unease that carried on well past the final whistle. 2 completely different refereeing philosophies, producing 2 completely different atmospheres on the very same day of the very same tournament. That contrast is really the heart of this story, not one bad performance existing in isolation, but a pointed reminder that a World Cup is only as fair and as consistent as the 90-plus individual judgment calls being made across more than 100 different matches, by more than 100 different human beings, each one interpreting the exact same rulebook slightly differently under exactly the same amount of pressure. What happened in Philadelphia will likely be remembered less for the football itself and more as a case study, the kind broadcasters, pundits, and governing bodies will reference the next time this conversation resurfaces about consistency in officiating at the game's biggest stage. Mbappe got his goal, France got their quarterfinal spot, and Paraguay's remarkable run ended the way underdog stories sometimes do, on a fine margin that arguably never should have needed a video review to sort out in the first place. But the lasting image from this match isn't the penalty kick, and it isn't even the final scoreline. It's the picture of a referee standing in the middle of a game that was visibly slipping away from him for most of the second half, and simply choosing not to reach for the one basic tool in his pocket that might have pulled it back before it got there.